שמי הילה דיין, דוקטור הילה דיין, אני בדרך כלל מרצה ביוניברסיטי קולג' אמסטרדם, והשנה אני בשבתון ואני נמצאת בארצות הברית, בניו יורק. אני פלו ב-NYU Remark Institute וגרה ממש על קולומביה ב-115. אז יש איתי כאן כמה שכנים. אז ברוכים הבאים לכל מי שיצטרף אלינו. מיד אני אתן לאורן לפתוח ולהציג את הרציונל של השיחה שלנו היום. אני גם רוצה להודות מאוד לכל מי שהסכימה והסכים להשתתף באירוע הזה, במיוחד לסטודנטיות שיהיו הדוברות הראשונות שלנו, שהאומץ שלהם להיות כאן עם הפרצוף, עם השם המלא, הוא בלתי יתואר בנסיבות שנוצרו. ואני רק רוצה להגיד באופן כללי כמנחה שאנחנו מבקשים מאוד לשמור על חדות הדברים שלכם, לשמור על מסגרת הזמן. אנחנו רוצים לשמוע כמה שיותר קולות ודוברים ודוברות. בבקשה לא להאריך, אם יש שאלות באמת למקד אותם. לכולנו יש דעות ותחושות בנוגע למה שקורה, אבל באמת לנסות להתמקד בשאלות. המבנה של האירוע הוא כך שאנחנו נפתח עם הדברים של אורן בקצרה, אנחנו נציג את הדוברות, 3 הסטודנטיות ו3 חברי סגל. אנחנו נפנה אז בתום הדברים של 6 הדוברים, אנחנו נפנה למגיבים שלנו, אלון הראל, יעל שטרנהל, רייף זרייק, תודה רבה גם לכם שהסכמתם להשתתף באירוע הזה, ואז אני אפתח את האירוע לדיון כללי. אנחנו מקווים לשמור על מסגרת סבירה של 1.5 שעות, אם צריך עוד קצת זמן, אני אשקול לתת אותו, וזהו, שיהיה לנו אירוע מעניין. Now I'm officially opening in English. My name is Yael Shternhal, you all heard, and I want to introduce Professor Alon Harel, who is going to give us a prompt about the rationale behind making this event. Please, Alon.
Hello, everybody. I'm Raef Zreik from Beersheba, talking to Beersheba, but having in the background, I have the picture of protest in Columbia University. I have many contacts. I taught in Columbia University. I taught at Penn and Berkeley in the past, and I feel very much involved and in great connection with those places. I want to start just by framing the main issues that people will then relate to. First of all, by flagging an amazing book over a decade ago by Colin Johnson that was called Global Palestine. And it was a very provocative book at the time that made the argument that the smaller the Palestine territory and the less power Palestinians have on the land, the more the solidarity for Palestine becomes global as a social movement. And little he knew how much this would develop. And in 2024, it's amazing. The most impressive global social movement now is to free Palestine. It's the Palestine Solidarity Movement. The New York Times just 2 days ago had a very big article that its title was From Free Speech to Free Palestine, documenting the sequence of events of major civil action movements in the US and beyond. And this just shows how it has become a global protest, and the main cause, I suppose, it was at the time civil rights, and then it was movement, was the students in Europe, and then later on became the apartheid in South Africa, and the climate, and Occupy Wall Street, and etc. And now there is an incredible movement beyond campuses. Some 30,000 events since October 23 were recorded around the world, from Japan to Malaysia to Australia to India, of course, in the Arab world, Amman and Cairo and Beirut. But now the center has become the US, and especially the campuses. And this is what we debate, because that's become very controversial. there is a database that you might be interested in, University of Connecticut. Professor Jeremy Pressman documented something like 10,000 events in the US campuses, and you should really see it. And it actually documents the rise and fall and what the nature of it, and it's really replaced Me Too and replaces Black Lives Matters. This is the issue now. And it's of course us, for us in Israel, Palestine. It's about us. It's also about us, I would say. But beyond this impressive movement, there developed some different narratives about how to interpret it. This is why we're here, to hear your views about it. On the one hand, most descriptions around the world are, noting the movement for justice, anti-colonial, decolonial, human rights, carried by students and staff, quite often with great risk and dedication and sacrifices. Many of them suspended, some of them lose their degrees, police action, mass arrests, etc. But another narrative developed, especially among Jews and Israelis, that this is an aggressive and radical movement with great incidents of anti-Semitism, hatred to Israel, Iranian and Muslim money to brainwash the students, and a very, very negative view. So what is actually happening is we want to hear your eyewitness view from within. I say that the University of Connecticut database that I studied, and also I did a small analysis too, that shows that the vast majority of the movement and the messages are to do with form of solidarity, stop the war, stop the bloodshed, stop the genocide, as they call, stop the occupation and apartheid. But I documented, and also University of Connecticut, that about 15 to 70% of the messages and the events are more aggressive, like global intifada, from the river to the sea, by all means necessary. It's a minority that, of course, gets a lot of attention in the media, but nonetheless, it exists there. And many Jews, Jewish students and other Israelis report real, frustration and fear and harassment and abuse that, needs to be tabled and ignored. I think, it's problematic for the movement, which is for me a very positive and hopeful movement, but those edges actually tarnish it and make it more polarizing, perhaps if necessary. And also I note in my small analysis, and also University of Connecticut, that they're really missing some, messages of peace, perhaps, condemnation of violence and terrorism. These are not binationalism. The two-state solution is almost not existing. So there is some critique about this very impressive movement. The Israeli press has almost rallied, almost totally, including even Haaretz, with some exceptions, around the negative interpretation. I show you here just this, I hope you can see it, this front page of Israel Hayom, אנטישמיות מסביב לגלובס, which is very, very common to how it's interpreted in Israel. Many people make comparisons to Germany in the 1930s. Even Vera, which is the ועד ראשי האוניברסיטאות, the committee of the heads, the president of the university, wrote a very, very, very concerned statement about the radical anti-Semite and aggressive and violent campaign in the US campuses. I think overrated. But what's interesting is that the Israeli press, almost without exception, doesn't mention the connection of these protests to Gaza, to the destruction, to the ethnic cleansing, to the claimed genocide, to what's happening in the West Bank. It's if the protest just came out of its own. And that's something that is also very concerned about Israeli media, etc. So we'd like to connect the two. And just to finalize, Hila, I see four main issues that we want to discuss. For example, how the speakers see from their own experience, how they assess the movement and its goals, whether it is the narrative of social justice to the Palestinians and global movement for social justice, or maybe the more toxic sides of the movement against Jews and Israelis. And also, how can we achieve more reliable and credible coverage in Israeli media that maybe these people that are there can actually assist? And final question is a bit more political. In Israel at the moment, there is a great emerging, but over the last almost 2 years, there's a great movement against the government. and also the US campuses and the global movement is against the Israeli government, but the two don't meet. Perhaps how can a coalition be made, or some cooperation between the great mobilization in Israel that is to stop the war, to release the hostages and to topple the government, and also the great energy against the Israeli government in the global movement. So this is another question, whether some coalition can be made. So these are the key questions that we want to hear from you. Very much looking forward for academia, for equality, and other people that are watching to hear your experiences from within. So thank you.
Excellent, Oren. Thank you so much. I, of course, forgot to mention Academia for Equality, our host, and who presented, but here my friends on the chat who monitor the chat have put our link to join us. We are about, over 800 staff members and academics from Israel and from around the world, both Jewish Israelis and Palestinians, and we are working on several issues, but our main concerns now is what is happening in the Israeli academia, and particularly with the repression of Palestinian and critical voices. I'm now turning to our first speaker, Talia Levine from Brown University. And Talia, go ahead and please share with us your experience.
So hi everyone, my name is Talia Levine. I'm from Seattle, Washington, and I'm a first year at Brown University studying political science and visual art. And I co-founded the group that started at Brown and then spread to a bunch of other college campuses called Brown U Jews for Ceasefire Now. And so I think I'm just gonna walk you guys through what organizing as an anti-Zionist Jew has been like this year. So after October 7th, our Hillel, which is our Jewish community, became a very explicitly Zionist space and became a very explicitly solely pro-Israel space. There was no mention of Palestinians. And so when I was there, I felt like I don't feel like I really fit in here. Like, why is this Jewish group not talking about Palestinian liberation and talking about Palestinians? Like, why are we just talking about ourselves, like solely, like why? I wasn't comfortable with that. And so this new group was made to kind of just like have Jewish community on campus that wasn't explicitly Zionist, which then it became clear that as the school started to really crack down on pro-Palestinian protesters and just label them as anti-Semitic, there was kind of a need for Jewish students to at least start this wave of more radical protests at Brown, and set the precedent for them not being called anti-Semitic, because what the school was doing was they would just shut everything down by saying this is anti-Semitic, this isn't okay, even if it genuinely was not anti-Semitic. And so on November 8th, we published an op-ed that was answering about 7 questions that we felt like we had received a lot as anti-Zionist Jews. And it went all over the internet. And I can send it to you guys, but it was quite controversial because it was a lot more radical than a lot of the things that were being written at the time. And we got a lot of hate for it, both on campus and off campus. And then the day after we published that, 20 Jewish students sat in on University Hall, which is our main administrative building, calling for divestment and a ceasefire. And so later that day, the school arrested all 20 students. The charges were later dropped because later in the semester, one of my Palestinian classmates here was in Vermont for break and was shot because he was wearing a keffiyeh and speaking Arabic. And so that it didn't make any other statements. And so then another group of students organized, the Brown Divest Coalition, organized another sit-in in which 41 students were arrested, but they turned University Hall into the jail, which was a really big deal for a lot of people because the group that sat in were primarily students of color, and University Hall was built by enslaved people in the United States. So there was a lot when we left after first semester, it was just very intense, and we were kind of all figuring out how we make progress and like what do we do. And so we got back and we were like, okay, we need to do something big, but we can't do something illegal. And so we decided that Brown has a really big history of protest and activism. And so we have a lot of people who know a lot about Brown's history. And so we became I think the first university to do a hunger strike for Palestine and for divestment. And so in February of this year, we did an 8-day, 19-person hunger strike and full occupation of the campus center, or like the student center. Just with not even for divestment, just with the goal of having this report that we had not written, but this report that had originally been written by the university, and then we updated it and made it actually more accurate and a lot longer. We just wanted them to even like vote on it and to just agree to see it and just agree that like our demands were valid, but they didn't. They just said, nope, we're not going to listen to you guys. Like, they didn't even say in their press releases about us, they didn't even say the word hunger strike. They just said ongoing protest, ongoing demonstration. But we were also hearing from within other people in the university and other administrators that like what we were doing was working, and they were impressed, and we were not giving up. And that was like our third really big action. And we didn't think that we would have another big action this semester. But then the encampment at Columbia started, and then that started to spread to other schools. And we were like, oh, we kind of like, we have an opportunity to really do something here. Like, this could be kind of our end of year thing to really just like go it, because our summer break is like 4 months. And so this, like, that's a lot of time for a university to be profiting off of what I believe is genocide. And so we did the encampment, and I personally did not participate in the encampment, but I helped run social media for it. And so our encampment was one that actually did not get violent at all. And so we got a lot of really positive press coverage that was more positive for the university. And so we were a little bit like, no, actually, like the university was not this kind and benevolent, like, yay, protesters. They were doing a lot of stuff like very undercover to really like suppress any sort of protest. Like, they threatened to suspend all of us for over a year. They threatened to expel us. They put most of us on probation, and they just wanted to like basically say, if you guys break any of our rules, we will kick you out. And the one thing that didn't happen at Brown was they didn't call the police, and they didn't arrest anyone this semester. But they wanted us gone. After 6 days, they were like, we need them gone. We need to get ready for commencement. They're taking up way too much space. And so we made a deal with the administration to get the full divestment resolution on the agenda for our October corporation meeting. And so our school is governed by the corporation. It's like this big body of people that vote. And so they agreed to vote on divestment, which is really, really, really big, because for a while we thought that they would only agree to general arms manufacturer divestment and not full divestment. And so even though we know that there is no way that they're actually going to pass any sort of divestment.
אז זה לא אנטישמיות, ועדיין יש שם
excuse me.
בישראל.
No, excuse me.
Who is that? Okay.
We will not tolerate these sort of interruptions, please. We want to go on with our Talia, can you just round up 1 more minute? Okay.
Yeah, totally. And so now as we are preparing to head into summer, we're kind of just trying to figure out how we want to best approach this. And so it's been a lot of work, but this is the most of a Jewish community that I have kind of ever really felt. And like my mom co-founded our synagogue when I was little, and I like used to be on the board of directors of a Holocaust museum. And this is the most loved I have felt as a Jewish person for being a Jewish person, and not just by other Jewish students, but by other pro-Palestinian students in this movement.
Okay, thank you very much, Talia. I am again pleading everyone for patience. We will and we do have time for discussion, and you are welcome to ask questions during the discussion. Let's move forward with our speakers. I'm turning
but what is
no. This is
important to understand.
This is very disruptive, and we are not going to tolerate this. There will be time for questions and comments at the end of our speakers' line of interventions. Please. Sahar Bostock is a student at Columbia. Sahar, I'm turning to you now. Please. Thank you.
Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay. So hi everyone. Thank you for having this conversation. I appreciate your interest in what is going on beyond what the Israeli media is presenting. I am a PhD student here at Columbia. It's my 6th year. I'm working on the history of Palestine, and I'm working with a Palestinian advisor, Professor Rashid Khalidi. Maybe you've heard of him. This is just to tell you a little bit about my positionality here. I'm also, I would say, a member of the Israeli community, if you can say anything like that. So I'm on all of the neighborhood group chats, and I want to say I think this is important because we might, I hope I get to say something also about the share of the Israeli community in the coverage that you're receiving and in the approach to this protest. So I'm speaking not as a representative of the encampment, because I was not an active, I did not take an active part in it, but I am in the circles of some of the organizers. I have many friends who joined the protest, and I believe I can give somewhat of a good perspective for what is going on. And this is has been a process since October 7th, and as you all know, and protests have started the week after that, and I find them very inspiring. There's a great organization of students. I would think most of them are undergrads, but also graduate students who take part in this protest against what they see as the gravest moral crisis of their generation. They see themselves as continuing the legacy of the anti-war movements, the 1968 Vietnam War, and the movement against the war, and the movement of anti-apartheid that in 1985 occupied Hamilton Hall, the same hall that was occupied last week by our students. So they see themselves as continuing these movements, and they see how the university today cherishes the protests that were on campus in those days, because now the consensus is anti-war, now the consensus is anti-apartheid, and they assume, and I hope they're right, that they will be also part of the history of Colombia as the protesters that led to change. And there's a huge group of leadership that is Palestinian and anti-Zionist Jews. And if you want to talk about what is anti-Zionist, we can talk about that. These are part of the leadership of this movement, but there are also many other people who don't have an immediate relationship with Palestine. And I think the way that they have been mobilized is really impressive, that they care so much about what is going on there. And I think this is unprecedented. They see this, nevertheless, as a matter of internal policy, domestic policy in the United States, because of Biden's support to Israel, because of the funding that keeps on going even seven months after the beginning of this war, that is being approved by the Congress and sent to Israel. So this is not only a matter of what's going on in Israel-Palestine, but it is also an American policy issue. And the demands of the protesters, especially now after the encampment, but this protest has been going on for a long time, have been very practical. It's not only a call for attention. They want the university to divest from Israel-Palestine and from weapon technologies. And this is something the university was not willing to do and is still not willing to do. And this is the reason that the negotiations that happened in the last 2 weeks between the encampment representatives and the university fell, because the university does not want to even discuss or think about the option of divesting from technologies that support the war. So I think that in Brown, they reached some kind of an agreement about how they will continue forward and discuss that. At Columbia, it didn't happen. What did happen is a very major crackdown on the protesters, and it started a few months ago with suspending the organizations that were leading this protest, and then also the arrest of the activists in the encampment. The encampment started the day that our president Shafiq was giving a testimony in the Congress, and this was the reason for starting the encampment on that date, to get the attention of the media and to and I think the result is that the university acted with a lot of violence against the protesters. The campus was closed already before that started, so only students with IDs could access the campus. It's been like this now for 3 weeks, I think, something like that. Since last week, the university is completely shut down, and only people who live on it, which are students, can go in. In the last few days, faculty members were allowed, and finally today I could access my office at the library. But in the name of safety, they shut down the entire university, and most of the students cannot access what they really need in this period, which is the exams, or people who just want to do their work. So there is a great attempt of the university to shut down the protest, to prevent anything that might harm the image of the university. But I think it completely backlashed with the amount of police that was called, the arrests of the students themselves, and the continued police presence on campus and the entire neighborhood. I'm not sure how much more time I have. And I have, I guess, a lot to say. 1 more minute. So I want to say that there's a feedback loop here with the Israeli community around campus. Not everyone here is a student, but there are a lot of Israelis here. And I think the gap between what the protesters want and what the way that Israelis perceive it is huge. It's unbelievably huge. They see any kind of protest against the war in Gaza as some kind of support of Hamas. I think this is wrong. This is a very wrong interpretation of the protest. They see it as anti-Semitic. I think that the protest in campus was very peaceful, and there were some incidents outside of campus in the gates. Some people from the outside, I believe, came to join the protest. But as a Jew and as an Israeli, I did not feel targeted in any way. I think that the clashes that happened had a lot to do with people trying to create friction. And these also are not necessarily students. Some are students, I think, Israeli students, but some are not, coming from the outside and trying to create some kind of friction with Israeli flags and other calls. Some of them were video filmed. You can see that. The entire closure of the campus, the fact that we have a helicopter over our heads for 24/7, that also produces a certain feeling of fear, that we have something to fear from. So I think there's this kind of loop. But the people who were really targeted are the protesters who were arrested, some of them very violently, especially in the last time that they were arrested. And I really think these students are brave, even if I don't always find a role for myself or a place for myself in this protest, because I am used to protesting as Jews and Arabs who want to live together. This has been my whole life project, and it is not necessarily the most central message of this protest. It's much more critical about what Israel is doing today, and Israelis are just as leftists are just not in the center of it, and I think that's okay. Like that, sometimes we cannot be in the center of it. It's been years of activism that has been shared, and we still have a war. We still have so many children dying, and so this is the time that the protest is trying to be very strong with this message. I still think these students are very brave. They're paying a huge price for what they're doing, and I really hope they will somehow lead to change. And I invite you to ask questions in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Sar. And we move straight to our final student speaker, Cameron Patel. Cameron from NYU. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, I'm just going to begin with introducing myself and then a little of the context of what's been happening at NYU in the past 7 months. So one is that I am a sophomore at NYU. I study public policy with a focus on health and human rights. And since October 7th at NYU, there has been immediately there was a crackdown on speech. So from the start, they banned any kind of flyers on campus. And this ban was applied very unevenly. It theoretically applied to everyone, but in reality, it applied primarily to political flyering. But also, I have a job that involves me putting up flyers for our campus newspaper, which I work for. And the flyers are for advertisers. It's completely unrelated to anything political. And I was frequently stopped and interrogated by campus safety and even threatened with discipline for putting up ads for a gym. And this is part of a broader policy at NYU where when they increase the securitization on campus, it very unevenly targets students who are racialized as Black, Brown, or Middle Eastern. And so for me particularly, some people read me as Middle Eastern, some people read me as white, so it depends. But when people read me as Middle Eastern, especially assuming that I'm Arab, which I'm not, but people will assume that, and that impacts the way that I and students who are Arab are treated on campus. And so this is all prior to the encampments, just to add some context of what's been happening. And then I actually had a classmate in November who was contacted by the university for disciplinary action for putting up a flyer in the library. And they basically emailed her, and then she essentially was accused of putting up a political flyer, like a pro-Palestine flyer in the library. And they said that they identified her using facial recognition from the surveillance camera. And incidentally, she had not been in the state when this event took place. She was out of the state and she had to provide her flight records showing that she wasn't there. And very importantly, when facial recognition is being used, it statistically is more likely to misidentify Black and brown students, or Black and brown people generally, in the context of NYU, Black and brown students. And so there's also the potential that people can be falsely accused of breaking policies. And this is likely to disproportionately affect minority students. So again, this is all just like prior context. And then since the encampments went up at Columbia. And then in the week following, NYU started an encampment first in what's called Gold Plaza, which is an open area in front of a couple of the buildings. And the encampment wasn't actually blocking getting in and out, but then because it ended up becoming blocked because campus security decided to close the entire area down. And so then this was happening throughout all day. It was Monday, about 2 weeks ago. And I helped with some of the programming for this event specifically because it was also the first day of Passover. And so we wanted to also, there were several Jewish students who were involved in the organizing. And we wanted to do something, probably, ideally have a Seder, which we weren't able to do because the administration interrupted us as we were attempting to do our Seder to threaten us all with disciplinary action. Which I think is very relevant because it's an encapsulation of the experience of many Jewish students who are protesting and who are engaging with their Jewishness in these protests, and then are being threatened by the administration for themselves being anti-Semitic. And broadly about the protests, what I'm going to say is that there are anti-Semitic incidents that have happened at protests, right? It has happened. What is important to understand about the protests, and I'm going to speak specifically to NYU because this is where I go to school, is that the thing that unifies the protesters is the 4 central demands of the protest. The 4 central demands is 1, to divest. This is disclose and divest technically. So this is to divest from weapons manufacturers, and then also in line with BDS boycott guidelines, which gets to the second point, which is also in line with the PACB boycott. Specifically at NYU, we have a satellite location in Tel Aviv. And so the demands of NYU students is in line with the PACB boycott to shut down that location. And then the third demand is to get NYPD off campus. This is part of a long-standing and broad dispute between the students and the administration. And this gets back at something that Sahar mentioned, which is that a lot of these protests are also about domestic issues, especially around police violence and militarization. So on campus, one of the problems is that NYPD is around constantly, including inside of our buildings, and they do harass students, especially Black and brown students. And this has been a longstanding problem. And as the campus has become increasingly militarized and increasingly shut down and, adding these barriers and these points where they're checking your ID, this is again disproportionately affecting Black and brown people who are encountering the police, who are more likely to harass them, more likely to stop them and ask for their ID, even when they have it and they've shown it before. And so that's the third demand, is to get the NYPD off campus, because we have campus safety, who is supposed to be our campus safety. The school claims that they don't allow NYPD on campus, but then clearly they are. And then the fourth demand is amnesty for students who are protesting and who have faced disciplinary action. So students who have engaged in protests have been threatened and served with suspension. And when you were suspended at NYU, and from what I have heard also at Columbia, because our schools are very intertwined, they're both in Manhattan, there's a lot of overlap. So you can be evicted. If you are living in campus housing, you can be immediately evicted from where you're living before you even have like a trial with the university. There's a complete absence of due process in the disciplinary hearings, or in the lack of disciplinary hearings, really. So then, the final demand is essentially amnesty for people who have been suspended for participating in protests. And the main thing is that if you go to a protest, people will disagree on a range of things. You will find people who are explicitly for a two-state solution. You will find people who are explicitly for a one-state solution. You will find people who don't know because they're like, I don't live there. I just want Palestinians to have human rights. And that is like their central issue. The thing that unifies the protesters that I have seen is the four demands. And I don't always, like, I have been in and around the protests. I don't always agree with everything that everyone says. But I will say, and this is a very important point on safety, is that I have felt far less safe when people are assuming that I am Arab or Palestinian than I do when people are assuming that I'm Jewish. I wear a keffiyeh sometimes that was a gift from a friend of mine, and I've repeatedly been verbally harassed, including by other Jewish students at school, called a Nazi, had people explicitly make comments about my identity as a gay person in relation to my participation in the protests. And I think that it's very important that we mention this because when we're talking about safety and about the safety of Jewish students, that safety is not necessarily including the voices of Jewish students who are protesting and who are experiencing violence by the police and by the school. I have several friends who have been beaten by the police in the last 2 weeks, several friends who have been arrested participating in protests. I had a classmate who a video went viral of her being tackled by the police, and she's just like on the ground. There are 4 police officers on top of her, and she's just screaming. And it is hard to feel safe in that environment. And I am absolutely sympathetic to students who are feeling unsafe with the protests right now. I understand it is a heightened environment and people are across campus, people are elevated in terms of like tension and in terms of what they are willing to say. But I think a really important point is that there are students who are materially unsafe right now because they are being attacked by the police. And again, in the American context, that is very relevant because police violence, especially in New York City, is a big issue. And so for me and for many of my Jewish friends, talking about Jewish safety is also talking about Jewish students being able to protest without being arrested and attacked or being tear gassed. And so I think that's just a very important point.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Cameron. I'm back in the city after 20 years being a student, and I'm just horrified at the level of securitization of university space everywhere. So I corroborate entirely, you know, how difficult it is. It has become, how militarized. It's shocking. We're going to now start the part in which we invite faculty, and our first speaker is Yinon. Faculty, please, I will keep a much shorter time for you. So let's be succinct and to the point. Yinon Cohen from Columbia University is our first faculty speaker.
Hello. So I have 2 points that I'd like to discuss in the 5 to 8 minutes you said I'll be able to talk. I'm a professor at Columbia. I teach courses on Israel and on my actual field, but mostly now, this semester, Israel and the Palestinians. I've been 25 years in Tel Aviv, and then I moved to Columbia. So I'll talk about 2 issues. The first issue begins with an encounter near the encampment with an Israeli professor who is against the protest. At some point, he tells me, you know, in Israel, I vote Meretz. So I immediately ask, why don't you join me supporting the encampment? That's our only chance for peace, working with non-Israelis. Because these people don't want peace, he tells me. They want to kill me. These Columbia and Barnard students want to kill you, I ask? Don't fool yourself, he says. These naive 20 years old students are led by outside. So you already see the two issues here, 2 points. Outside agitators, and they want to kill me. Now, the outside agitators is a common theme in many protests. In the case of this protest, especially in Columbia, it's complete false. There are some extreme individuals, mostly outside the Columbia gates, sometimes inside the gates, saying unacceptable things, but they're not part of the encampment, and they certainly do not lead. They want to kill me. Where did this come from? So I don't think it's atypical. I think he views the harsh anti-Zionist, settler colonialist criticism of Israel as implying that decolonization means the destruction of Israel and ultimately threatening his own life directly. And most likely his interpretation of the slogan "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free" is the most anti-Israeli possible interpretation. One Islamic state from the river to the sea that either oppresses Jews, expels them, or kills them. So what are we to do with such Israelis and Jews? Do you think that if the students will change the slogan to "From the river to the sea, Palestinians will be free," then my Columbia colleague will support them? Remember, he's a Meretz voter, and I doubt it. I doubt it. He wants to hear the students say that they support peace and a two-state solution, a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. But the main concern of the student at this point is to stop the killing in Gaza, reach a ceasefire, and free Palestinians from Israel's occupation. Now, they believe that Israel must not define itself as a Jewish state if Palestinians are to be free. The students have zero tolerance for any Jewish domination between the river of the sea. And they identify Zionism as the root cause for this Jewish supremacy in the area. Which brings me to my second point, and this is the importance and salience of anti-Zionism in the protest. In Israel, there is not much anti-Zionist rhetoric. Legally, political parties cannot be open about their anti-Zionism. A party is not allowed to run for election if its program includes negation of the existence of the state of Israel as a Jewish state. But also politically, anti-Zionists in Israel prefer to present their positions in softer, positive terms, rather than using explicit anti-Zionist rhetoric that will deter Jewish liberal Zionists. Hence the slogan "Equality for all," a state for all its citizens, and the like. Now, this is not the case in Colombia. Anti-Zionism is a major component of the protest. Jewish Voice for Peace, the pro-Palestinian Jewish group, defines itself as the largest anti-Zionist progressive Jewish organization in America. This is the first sentence in their website. I think that when Talia spoke, I think it was her second sentence. As an anti-Zionist Jew, I want to. Now, it's important for the student, it's important for Jewish Voice for Peace to declare that they're anti-Zionist, whatever that means. In the Passover Seder, in the encampment, there was a sign saying, "Zionism is chametz." My sense is that most activists, even most protesters, are ardent anti-Zionist. And moreover, my impression is that the anti-Zionist sentiment in America has grown in recent years, though I haven't seen any hard evidence on this issue. Now, why is anti-Zionism so important for the protesters? Well, one major reason is because this is a major part of the Palestinian narrative. If you remove anti-Zionist discourse from permissible discussion, you deny the Palestinian narrative of dispossession. And this is completely unacceptable in the context of the protest movement. Now, the pro-Israelis in Colombia try to block any anti-Zionist expression. They try to do so by labeling anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism. That's an old tactic of stifling criticism of Israel by labeling it as anti-Semitic. Now, some pro-Israelis claim that anti-Zionist speech threatened them and create an unsafe environment for them. Now, unsafe environment may violate Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, and universities may run into serious trouble if they don't address it. Now, are Jewish students really threatened by anti-Zionist expression? I don't know, but it's possible. But we should note that if they are threatened, it is because Israel, for years, has been blurring the distinction between Jewishness and Zionism. Now, there are few attempts in universities and even in Congress to pass...
בוא נשתדל לסכם, כן? Okay.
Yeah.
1 minute.
Yeah, 1 minute. There are few attempts in universities and even in Congress to pass anti-Semitism definition that will classify anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism. Some states in the US have already adopted such a definition. Now, in an open letter to the President of Columbia, some of us, Jewish faculty at Columbia, write, labeling pro-Palestinian anti-Zionist expression as anti-Jewish hate speech requires a dangerous and false conflation of Zionism with Jewishness, of political ideology with identity. Now, in Columbia thus far, no definition of anti-Semitism has been adopted. I view it as a mini victory, because if they will adopt some kind of a definition, it will be a terrible definition. But when asked about it in Congress, the leaders of the university insinuated that have adopted a definition that includes criticism of Israel as an anti-Semitic speech. Now, back to our merits voter who is afraid of the student who will kill him, perhaps this explicit anti-Zionist discourse is, one of the major threats to him. Thank you.
תודה רבה ינון, ואנחנו עוברים מיד לסמדר בן נתן. We're going to hear סמדר בן נתן from the University of Washington.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here with us today. As Hila just said, I'm teaching as an adjunct professor at the University of Washington in Seattle. This is a big public university with 50,000 students in my campus, which is the main one of three. I'm both Israeli and Jewish, and I moved to the United States with my family in 2016, almost 8 years ago. And I also have two children who are graduate students, one of them in a university, public university in California, and the other one in a university in Germany. So the three of us, I think, give kind of a picture of several campuses. And despite some worrying questions from friends and family in Israel, how we were doing amidst this wave of anti-Semitism, I can say to all of you and to all of those who worry about us, we are doing just fine. And I think we're doing much better and we are much safer than Jews are in Israel these days. So what I want to talk about is what I'm seeing on my campus. Of course, these protests involve a multitude of experiences, and I will share my own experiences and my reflections about the discourse of what is going on following that in the last 7 months. I will especially focus on the arguments of anti-Semitism and the weaponization of anti-Semitism arguments to silence speech that is supportive of Palestine, something that has been happening long before October 7th, but has become much, much worse. And those who are making claims of anti-Semitism, I agree with Cameron. It's not that there is no anti-Semitism, there is, and there are anti-Semitic expressions, but this has not been the major tone of the protests. And people making these arguments are at the same time, if you look at other things they are saying, at the same time, they are justifying Israel's war on Gaza and trying to divert the discourse away from criticizing what is happening in Gaza. What we see in the discourse is a battle around images of victims and perpetrators and trying to paint a binary picture of perfect victims or perfect perpetrators, while Jews in the United States look at themselves as eternal ahistoric victims, as a religious minority, which they actually are, and they have and are sometimes suffering anti-Semitism, but they are reflecting that image onto the state of Israel as representing their experience, and therefore they see protection of Israel as protection of their own rights as a religious minority, which we in Israel don't see the same way. Just to give you a picture of what's happening on our campus, an encampment has been established a week ago. We are on the West Coast, so we're a little far away from the center of where this process has been happening until now. But there has been activism on campus ever since the week of October 7th, including various protests, occupying the office of the president, demanding divestment, something that has been removed by the university police. So every university has a security or police force of their own, and usually they don't need to call in cops and police that always escalate the situation and make it more violent. In our campus, there is also a group of faculty for justice in Palestine that have a stand there, and there has been a letter circulating in support of the protesters that over 237 faculty and staff have signed the letter. So have I experienced anti-Semitism, and in what way? And in what way have I seen anti-Semitism in the discourse around me? Right after October 7th, on October 11th, I got a message on a WhatsApp group of Israeli and Jewish community around the Seattle area, noting that on that Friday, there was going to be a protest of pro-Palestinians on campus, and saying we must go there and stop that from happening. And one of the reasons that they have been putting forth to justify the attempt to silence a protest in favor of Palestinian rights or expression is that Jewish faculty on campus are being threatened, and therefore they are working from home and not getting into campus. Now, as a Jewish faculty, I knew that was not true to me. The evening before, I met other 3 Jewish faculty that likewise have not been threatened, have not been working from home, and in no other way have been feeling unsafe. And of course, I said that in the group, and I implored them not to arrive on campus and create clashes. These arguments about what is happening on campuses are very prevalent. They are unverified, they are unverifiable, and outside organizations are using this ability to tell stories about what is happening in campuses, using campuses as their playing ground to try and silence pro-Palestinian speech. Now, why is that tactic
Take
useful?
1 minute. Okay, 1 minute to round up.
Yes. This tactic is really useful because in the American environment of free speech, you can't go and say, don't let them protest, silence them. But you can frame your discourse in a way that we are caring and protecting our Jewish students and our Jewish faculty. And what we are doing is caring and protecting and not silencing anyone. The only 2 threats and accusations that I got over these periods were from within the Jewish and Israeli community. I got 2 emails to my university email, one of them with an explicit threat of violence. I know they were Jewish or Israeli because they were in Hebrew. They were threatening me as a peace activist, as a member of the board of B'Tselem, and saying they would get to me after they are done with Hamas. And in another email from a community member, I was accused of risking our students because I am teaching about Israel and using the term colonialism. That was referring to a faculty teach-in that I was not participating in, and I was not going to participate in, but still the community organized to send me emails and ask me not to do that because I would be risking Jewish students on campus. I am concerned about Jewish students on campus. I teach Jewish students on campus. If something was happening to them, I want to know that. But so far, what we have seen going on a lot is weaponizing this idea of anti-Semitism and not the other way around. And the interpretation of the demonstrations are coming many times. And this is why this discourse resonates with people, because Jewish students self-identify as a religious minority that needs to be protected and that is connected to Israel. And the mere vision of Palestinian flags on campus and the words that come with them are experienced as an identity threat, but is rarely more than an identity threat. to Jewish communities on campus.
Great, Smadar, thank you. I'm turning to Lee Mordechai from Princeton University. Lee, please, let's keep it short because we want to also get to the third part of this event and hear our responders. So thank you, Lee. You go next.
Thanks. I'll try to be short. So I'm a faculty member originally at Hebrew University, but I'm currently on sabbatical here in Princeton, New Jersey. And the broader context of the encampment is that there's been a series of protests here at Princeton since October, really, both on campus and off campus. And most of these were not very big, maybe a few dozen attendees or so. Over the past, let's say, few months, there's been an increasing number of better attended events and talks. The encampment itself started 13 days ago. The organization is entirely student-led, and its demands are for the university to divest financially from companies that are involved in Israel's military campaign, occupation, and apartheid. They demand that Princeton disclose and end the research on weapons funded by the Department of Defense in this country, in the United States, that Princeton refrains from any connection with Israeli institutions rather than individuals, and cultivate affiliations with Palestinian institutions instead, and they demand that Princeton calls for a permanent ceasefire in Gaza. The university actively works against the protests here. A day before the encampment was started, all the organizers' internal documentation and plans and identities were all leaked online. In response to all this, the vice president for campus life threatened that anyone violating Princeton's protest rules would be arrested immediately and removed from campus. And the next day, exactly that happened. So 2 students were arrested and in 5 minutes, both evicted from their housing and expelled from the university. There was no process involved or anything like that. The administration later allowed them to return to their housing, but they're still not part of the university. All of this is why Princeton, as far as I know, is the only encampment that still does not have tents. So students remain in the encampment 24/7, including in the rain. At night, they sometimes do shifts. At the same time that students in Columbia had their sit-in in Hamilton Hall, 13 students at Princeton had their own sit-in in the administration building, and again, almost immediately arrested, evicted, and expelled from the university. 5 days ago, another group of students began a hunger strike in support of the expelled students, and essentially demanding that the university meet them and drop the criminal and disciplinary charges against the 13 students that were previously arrested. Yesterday, so after 12 days, it was the first time the university administration actually spoke to the protesters, but the meeting got nowhere. There's a growing number of faculty on campus who are very dissatisfied with how the administration is dealing with this entire situation and the overall lack of dialogue. And they tend to voice their opinion through petitions, open letters, and publications in the university newspaper. As for the population of the encampment, it really changes drastically based on weather and time of day. So at late nights, overnight, there's probably like 10 people or so, or maybe less present. But over a nice weekend, they can probably reach like a few hundred people who would come there with including families and so on. So I'll talk to a few points to link to the things that are discussed in Israel. So one is the question of anti-Semitism. So for all my time, both inside and around the encampment, I saw or heard nothing anti-Semitic. There are many Jews who are among the student organizers. There's always kosher food there. Shabbat services are held within the encampment. One can speak Hebrew openly. I regularly identify as an Israeli when I speak to people there. Some Israeli parents bring their children there and speak to them in Hebrew. This does not feel like a dangerous place in any way. The organizers do their best to remove anything that can seem controversial and draw attention away from their main point, and I'll give 2 examples. One is the use of the term intifada. Early on in the protests, they sometimes use the word intifada in chants, but during the second day of the encampment, a Jewish student organizer wrote in the university's newspaper that they've decided to drop that chant because they feel that some people might get the wrong idea about what this intifada actually is. And they have not used it since. So that's one example. And another example is on the first day of the protest, the high school boy from the broader community brought a Hezbollah flag to the protest. And this was actually portrayed in Israeli media as Hezbollah flags in the plural. at Princeton. In reality, the flag was there for only a few minutes. The organizers immediately approached the boy and requested that he remove the flag, which he did. There have been no similar incidents since then. As to knowledge, unlike how the student protesters are portrayed in Israeli media, the ones I've seen and spoken to are very knowledgeable about the conflict. Many of the students involved study the region. The very first feature of the encampment was a library of free books about the conflict, the region, and associated topics such as decolonization. The encampment has regular lectures, reading groups, and discussion groups led by external speakers, faculty, and graduate students. And topics can be very specific here. And one topic, for example, was how Israel treats its Ethiopian and Eritrean foreign workers. As for violence, there have been 0 cases of violence on the protesters' side. One counter-protester, so pro-Israeli student, was arrested after he assaulted the campus security officer. But there's not been any physical interaction that I've seen or heard between protesters and counter-protesters. And as for student discomfort, so this is often used as an argument against these protests, and I find it hard to accept in the Princeton case, which I know very well. I mean, in the context in which students believe that a genocide is taking place in Gaza, which is, again, plausible according to the International Court of Justice, and because students believe that their government, the United States government, is closely complicit in this genocide, again, with plenty of supporting evidence, what should we actually expect them to do? If the stakes are really so high, of course their protest must be loud and maybe uncomfortable to some. So they're essentially doing exactly what they should be doing as students who are aware of what's going on in the world around them and taking responsibility for what their own country is doing. Thank you.
תודה רבה. Thank you, Lee. I just want to mention very quickly that early in November, Academia for Equality issued suggested guidelines to university administrations. We called it Campus at War, Tolerate, Deliberate, Educate. That was our message for university campuses. Unfortunately, our guidelines were not really listened to, and we see the results. Now I'm turning to our 3 respondents, and they are in this order: Alon Harel, Yael Shternhal, and Raef Zreik. And please, the same request. Let's keep it very succinct. And I turn to you, Alon.
I understand I have 6 minutes, you said, or 7?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll be very short. Of course, I'm not in the US now. I'm in Israel. I'm actually just reading articles about it and looking at videos and so on. And I'm participating in some of the protests in Israel. So I'm not going to say what the dominant voices are in the United States, but I'll say some general thing about how I see it. First of all, it is quite clear that in most cases, in protests of this magnitude, there are people with different voices and so on, and some voices are more extreme, some voices are less extreme. I want to remind all of you that when there were the Vietnam protests, which are now remembered in the United States, and I think all over the world as very positive, there were some demonstrators that were identifying with the dictatorship in Vietnam, in North Vietnam, and so on. So we all know that every big protest has a lot of, includes a lot of voices. Some of these voices are more legitimate, some of these voices are less legitimate, and the question is, how will it be remembered is a question that has to do with some luck and who is a dominant and what will be remembered. Naturally, in every protest, and I assume this is true also in this case, the extreme voices get more than their fair share in the media because the media is interested in the extreme voices. And when I speak about the extreme voices, I think that it's both on the pro-Palestinian camp and on the pro-Israeli camp. In both cases, there is a tendency of the media to highlight the more extreme voices. I'm a little bit concerned with the focus on anti-Semitism, and I say a word about it. I think I think there are, of course, anti-Semitic voices. I think it is clear. I mean, some people here mentioned, but it's clearly not very dominant in the movement. But at the same time, I want to say that there may be anti-Israeli voices that are also illegitimate. So supporting Hamas or calling to burn Tel Aviv or calling upon Israelis to move back to Poland as if all Israelis came from Poland. I actually didn't. Are voices which, in my view, are illegitimate. The fact that they are illegitimate doesn't mean that we ought to prohibit them. I don't think that I'm not sure if it ought to be illegal. What I mean is that it's beyond the reasonableness, and therefore the fact that those who criticize the protest on the grounds that it is anti-Semitic, I think are wrong. As a matter of fact, I think there are many more voices that are radically or can be interpreted as supporting violence. Some of them, I don't say that, by no means I say there's a dominant line. I only say that not everything that is illegitimate must be anti-Semitic. There are things that it is illegitimate to state or to assert without them being anti-Semitic. So I think that this is to some extent responding to Inon or Iron. So of course anti-Zionism is legitimate, but not every voice that is anti-Zionist is legitimate, precisely as not any voice that is Zionist is legitimate. The question of how, the question that I'm really concerned is how will this protest be remembered and what its effects will be. And I'm both hopeful but also worried. And the effect that I am interested in are of course, there are effects in the American society, in the US society, in the political environment, and so on and so on. And there are effects that have to do with the Israeli society. And I'm worried that the growing protest may, and I speak now about the possible negative effects of this. There are possible good effects of it, but I'm going to focus on the possible negative effects. I'm worried about effects that are not the ones that people have mentioned. I'm worried about the greater alienation of Israelis from the scientific or cultural community abroad. I think that the protesters and the way, and to a large extent, it's the way the protest is being depicted in Israeli newspapers and Israeli media, is going to lead people not to go abroad. I've heard people, kind of candidates for PhD that are rethinking their ideas. They will be less receptive to progressive and liberal voices from abroad. And I don't think, I'm not going to advise the protesters. Some of them are doing great work. I'm only saying that this is a negative effect that should be considered or should be taken into account, especially and I think be made to be known to the people who are organizing the protest, especially by Israelis who live abroad and can communicate these things. They are very, very important. The messages that the protesters make have effect not only in the United States, but also in Israel. That said, and my last point, I think I'm still on time, yeah, Hila. I want to say that to a large extent, the shock to Israelis' moderate left, Zionist left, and so on, the shock comes from the fact that it's explicitly anti-Zionist, which I believe is legitimate. I don't share this sentiment, but I believe it's totally legitimate. To a large extent, there are many, many people in Israel who are Zionists and regard themselves as humanists. And I think it's very important that even those who are anti-Zionists understand that Zionist left could be their ally, or could be ally at least for tactical reasons. They are not, they shouldn't be demonized. And that's, I think, very important. At the same time, the Zionist left, the professor that somebody here mentioned, I think it was Inon, that thought that everybody's going to kill him. It's quite important to convey the message to Zionist leftists that the protesters who are anti-Zionist are not going to kill them, and to mention to the protesters who are anti-Zionist that not all Zionists support genocide or apartheid. I wanted to.
Thank you, Alon.
Yeah, I'll just say one sentence. I want to say that my analysis focused on things that I thought were are underemphasized in the discourse. So that's
absolutely. Thank you so much, Yael Shternhal from the Hebrew University. Are you with us? Thank you.
Hi, Hila. I'm
and
actually,
your daughter. Sorry.
Yeah, my daughters are mercifully now in the bath room, taking their nightly bath, so I should have some peace and quiet. I'm at Tel Aviv University. I teach history and American studies. And I see my dean here on the Zoom, which I was not entirely expecting. Okay, I'm just going to be very brief. I wanted to say a few words about how this is playing out in Israel, because that's, I feel, where I can contribute. I've been basically doing this full time for the past couple of weeks. And here's what I have to say. So I think Israelis, the vast majority of Israelis have a very hard time distinguishing between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And they perceive any expression of anti-Zionism as personally directed at them and as threatening and violent and just unacceptable. And I think that's a real, that's a real challenge, helping people understand that Zionism is an ideology and that it is perfectly legitimate to reject it and to have a different vision of what life between the river and the sea should look like. And that's a real uphill battle. Second, I think that Israelis have a very hard time accepting the fact that Palestinians and pro-Palestinians in the United States are now mobilized, organized, and well-funded. And I've been having these arguments with people on, in social media and face-to-face, occasionally in a television studio, about the fact that it is perfectly legitimate for Palestinians to have the same kind of resources and the same kind of organizing that Jewish people have had in the United States, for a century, if not a century and a half. And that we should come to terms with the fact that, this is what it is now. And there's nothing, there's all this outrage here about the Wall Street Journal story telling, kind of exposing the fact that Students for Justice in Palestine was organized and ready and trained and, and I was like, okay, that's called organizing. And why do Jews get to have AIPAC and AJC and ADL and all these other groups, including the one that I'm proudly on the board of, the New Israel Fund? Why is that okay? And when Palestinians do exactly the same, then that's suddenly a force of anti-Semitic violence and an existential threat to Jewish life, both in Israel and the United States. And then my third point is that I think it's just a lot easier for Israelis to obsess about what's happening at Columbia or Brown or NYU or UCLA than it is to talk about what's happening 90 minutes south of here in Gaza. And the level of fascination that Israelis have with the events on campuses is, I find, truly startling. And sometimes even I, who specialize in US history and am always, deeply consumed by anything that happens in the States, more or less, sometimes I will be like, you know what, who cares? Can we talk about reality here rather than about who got arrested, and why, by which administration? How has that become the main story rather than this hopeless, godless war that we find ourselves in the midst of now on 7 months and counting? So, I don't know, maybe this is just my own frustrations with the public discourse here and how it has played out. And then I want to say one thing, and I want to say it to the student demonstrators and to anyone who's in the States. I'm going to be spending next year in the States, so we'll have a closer look at the dynamics there. But for now, for where I'm sitting in my apartment in Ramat Aviv, or Sheikh Munis, as some would call it, I personally, as someone who's been committed to the Palestinian freedom struggle my whole life, and I wrote a piece about the similarities between the American South and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict in 2011, before I had tenure, before I really even had a job. So, I've been thinking about these questions for a long time, and before I had the kind of job security that I have today. And I am very grateful for the interest that suddenly Americans and young Americans and passionate and connected Americans have in this. I've been clamoring for this. I've been waiting for this. I've been hoping for this for many, many years. But I do want to say one thing, as someone who lives here, who raises children here. At the end of the day, these definitions that I feel people are so attached to, I'm a post-Zionist, I'm an anti-Zionist, kind of carrying the banner of anti-Zionism proudly. And carrying the banner of Zionism proudly to the same extent. At the end of the day, there are 15 million people who live here. And we need to find a way to live together, to share this space, to share these resources, to be human beings to one another. And I personally, honestly, do not care if it's 1 state, 2 states, 3 states, 4 states. That is not the issue for me. The issue is, how do we find a way to live in dignity, in prosperity, in security, and in safety for everyone? And I urge you to think beyond the abstractions and beyond these collectivities, and to think about the people living here. Those of us who are born here, who are having their children here, and the urgent need to find a way forward that will be both practical and just. I want to see a solution in my lifetime, and I urge you to think about solutions and to think about ways forward for all of us that will not only sound right in principle, but that will actually work, and that will actually allow us to all be here and live in this beautiful, tormented, bloody part of the world as equals, and as people who practice the kind of love and respect that you expect of us, that we expect of ourselves.
Thank you so much, Yael. And our last responder is Raef Zreik, Van Leer Institute. And sorry, I made a mistake. Yael is from Tel Aviv University. Raef, are you with us?
Yes, I'm with you. Can you hear me?
We can hear you well and sound.
Okay, so let's make it short. Time's late and everybody got to run, including me. So I probably would pose a few points very shortly, some of them in the form of a question, some of them in the form of a short comment. So I'm glad that you're holding this event. It's extremely important conversation that is going on here. So one, probably something in theory, it becomes clear that the name of Palestine and the question of freedom are becoming very tight, in the sense that the history of the idea of freedom, it's not an abstract text that Kant and John Stuart Mill and John Locke wrote, but it gained its meaning through the struggles of women, workers, immigrants, Jews, and now Palestinians. So freedom gains its meaning from concrete struggles. And it's important to see that as a matter of, for those who do political philosophy. Now, I want to add a few questions, remarks, thoughts at the beginning of a conversation. So one about the gap that we heard about the message of the protesters, which is basically a message for justice, and the way this message is being understood, interpreted, thought, felt as a message of destruction, as a message of threat to average Israeli, and not only average Israeli, merits voter who's well-educated and teaches at Columbia. This is something to think about. Is this unique case? Is the Israeli case unique in this regard or not? Something to think about. Why is that the case? I have my own ideas, but it's now not the time. And in this regard, I do suggest something for us Palestinians and for the Jews. I think the Palestinian shouldn't be to continue to be naive and say, oh, we're just demanding justice, because it is justice bears some threat to Jewish existence in Palestine. And we should acknowledge that. And the average Israeli should acknowledge that this threat might be because his existence is based until now in some form of injustice. I think kind of a beginning of this mutual recognition can allow to start a conversation which must lead to try to answer under what conditions the Jewish existence could feel unthreatened on the condition that is not superior at the same time. So the answer must be in good faith. The third point, which I'm struggling with to understand, and for me it says would mean a lot. What does the dividing line mean between those pro-Palestinian protesters and those who are not protesting with Palestine? I can imagine many those who doesn't protest with Palestine that actually they are ready to have sort of a two-state solution. Some of them even might a binational state. So it's interesting, what is the meaning of the dividing line? Because this is a question in order to understand the deep meaning of this protest. So is it Zionist against anti-Zionist? Is it one state against two states? Is it those who are influenced by decolonization against those who, or it's a white supremacist against what? So what is the dividing line? So this is something to contemplate. The fourth point, I'm about to finish. The fourth point is extremely sensitive here. And this whole issue of anti-Zionism, I wanted to ask myself and to ask many others, what does it mean to be anti-Zionist at this stage in history when Zionism has in many ways fulfilled its basic minimal mission to bring many Jews into Palestine? So is it more a question of how to read history, to justify history? I believe most anti-Zionists do not think that we should bring the Jews back to Europe. Most of them actually think that Jews should continue to live in Palestine as equals. Many of them, like me, think that binationalism is actually the solution, whether it's in two states or in one state. So what does the language of anti-Zionism is playing? What role does it play? I'm asking this question because I'm obsessed with distinctions between the historical, the ethical, and the political. And I'm, as a political animal, though I see the relation between the three, sometimes one should foreground the political at the expense of the ethical momentarily and on the expense of the ideological. And here I want to say something extremely radical in terms of thought is radical. I'm wondering what is the influence of the Jewish anti-Zionists in the overall discourse? For me, as a Palestinian, the anti-Zionist discourse bring to the fore the question of the Jews that wants to distinguish themselves from the Zionists, and in this sense, I can bracket the question of anti-Zionism. I know I'm saying something extremely controversial, and I would be more glad to speak about the massacres in Gaza, the continuation, the occupation and the disposition, the supremacy of, even without mentioning the word Zionism. So this is something to contemplate about what does it mean to be anti-Zionist. The last point, we're witnessing a solidarity.
Okay? Let's round it up. Let's round it up, make it short. Okay?
Yeah. Half minute. We're witnessing a solidarity movement with Palestine without a Palestinian leadership that it's clear what they want. And this is, I do believe, that it's pretty much unprecedented in history. And this is probably, it puts many problems for the solidarity movement in the long run. I stop here. Thank you.
Excellent. We are at New York time, New York